Every woodworker needs a strong workbench, but a lot of people also need a bench that comes apart quickly and easily. Maybe they need to transport it a lot, or maybe they don't have a shop and they actually have to take the whole bench apart when they're not working. And if you need a bench that's strong, but also disassembles quickly and easily, that is a tall order. That is going to require some clever engineering. I think we all know, if we need clever woodworking, well, I am, adequate. I'm good enough. People ask me a lot of workbench questions, and recently I get the most questions about Will Meyer's Moravian workbench. The Moravian bench is a copy of an actual job site bench from the 19th century. It assembles and disassembles with astonishing speed, no fasteners, and no tools except a mallet. How is this possible? The secret to this amazing modular design mostly comes down to one very clever joint. Where the stretcher, that's the long part, meets the leg is this fantastic connection. This is called a tusked mortise and tenon. It's a lot like a standard mortise and tenon, but with the addition of a tapered key that holds the joint together. The Moravian bench makes good use of this joint, but plenty of other benches use it too. A lot of European workbenches were also made to be portable. This one is a classic Danish design, and you can see that the main joint is the tusked mortise and tenon. I'm sure this bench is easy to disassemble and move, but the builder used big, heavy components with lots of surface area, and I bet this bench is very stable when it's assembled. Here's how the joint works. Your workbench leg has a big mortise cut all the way through it, and the long stretcher is cut into a tenon which goes all the way through the leg, with lots of room on the far side. Then a smaller mortise is cut through that tenon, and a tapered key is tapped into that mortise to draw the joint together and tighten everything up. If you need to take the joint apart, just knock out the key, and the whole thing is quickly disassembled. Honestly, explaining it is probably more difficult than cutting it. We'll cut this joint from a couple pieces of construction-grade 4x4. Even though this isn't furniture construction, it's still useful to plane a face and an edge as reference surfaces, and mark them so it's easy to find them again. Since my wood is about 3.5 inches wide, this 1¼ inch chisel is perfect. It's about 1/3. I'll set a double pin gauge directly to this chisel and gauge my mortise line. Then I'll use the same gauge to strike my tenon lines on my stretcher. This is a very long tenon, so be careful that the pins don't drift into the grain, and carry those gauge lines right across the end grain. I also like to run a pencil through these lines, especially if I'm working in a pale wood. Believe it or not, this is exactly like cutting a furniture joint. So you still want to strike knife lines at your shoulders, chisel them into a clean knife wall, and use that to guide your back saw into a nice perpendicular cut. To saw the cheeks, I'll stay right on my line and rip down until I get to the maximum depth of my back saw. Now I have a nice straight cut established, and I can come in with a panel saw and not worry about drifting off my line. The panel saw is the traditional choice for cutting extra large joinery, and it works great. Of course, you might have noticed that big black rectangle in the upper left part of the shot. That is a filming light. Maybe I should move it. That's much better. On this channel, we demand the highest standards of film production. I stayed right on my line during the whole cut, so the tenon comes out nice and straight and doesn't need much trimming. We can go directly to the mortise. I'm cutting the mortise with a big timber framing chisel, but you don't need any specialized tools. A standard bench chisel is more than enough for this soft pine construction lumber, and if your widest chisel is only 1 inch, just use that. Bench building is a terrible time to obsess over having exactly the right tools. Get the job done with whatever you have. I chop in from both sides of the joint, clean out most of the waste, and then chop back to my knife lines. I leave this step until last, so I have a little bit of waste to lever against. The inside of the joint is quite rough, so I do some light paring, test fit the joint, pare a little more, and there's a good fit. The joint has very little wiggle room, but it slides together easily. Making it super tight wouldn't accomplish anything. I've got a nice piece of maple, and I'm resawing it down to the width of my mortise chisel. I cut the piece fat and slowly plane it down to get a good fit. It can be a tiny bit narrower than the chisel. That will actually help. Now, I pencil in a 5-degree angle and a curve at the top to prevent splitting when I hit the piece. The completed key makes it easy to lay out my mortise in the big tenon. You can see that I'm sliding the key back behind where the leg will be. That way, the key can't bottom out in its mortise until it pulls the joint tight. Cutting the second mortise is even easier because I can use my regular mortise chisel, and that extra heavy blade plunges right into this soft pine. I'm especially careful right at the end because I need one wall of my mortise to match the angle of my key. It's not difficult, but you do need to go slowly. And now, the whole joint comes together pretty smoothly. Now, what makes this joint so great is how easy it is to put together. Take your stretcher, slide it right into your leg. Then take your tapered wedge and put it into your stretcher mortise, and then give it a few taps with your mallet. Here's how it works. The wedge obviously is tapered, and we've cut a corresponding taper into this mortise. So as we drive the wedge down, it draws everything together and creates a very tight, very solid joint. Now, this is great, but as I was building it, I figured out a way I could make it even better. Let's go back to that Danish workbench and go back to the close-up of the leg stretcher joint. You can see how the original craftsman used a wide plank for his stretcher, where I just used a beam. That's really important because it gives him a very big shoulder above and below the joint. If we come back to my joint, you can see that I've just used this 4x4 post, and that means my shoulders are here on the sides. That's fine, but it's not great because as you're using the bench, a lot of the force is this way. The leg wants to bend back and forth, and the stretcher basically has like up and down pressure on it. So having the shoulders over here isn't ideal. Much better to have the shoulders on the top and the bottom, where they're really going to resist that tendency to rack up and down. So if you're going to make this joint, it would be great to use a wide plank for this. Something like maybe a 2x6 or a 2x8. Just construction lumber. And then, when you want to take this joint apart, well, just a couple of hits with a mallet takes out your wedges. You can pull apart the individual joints. You can have a whole bench taken apart in less than a minute. Not bad, right? But I know what a lot of you are thinking. Rex, that is a very nice joint. I might even want that joint on my bench, but there is a lot of joinery there, a lot of chopping mortises and stuff. And, you know, a lot of us, we're not going to know how to do that until we already have a bench. So for all those beginner woodworkers out there, don't you have some sort of other joint that works the same but is easier to make? Well, as a matter of fact, I do. There's another version of this joint that works especially well with a laminated approach. So I've prepared 3 white pine boards, and they're going to be the leg of my imaginary bench. The leg needs a mortise through the center, a lot like I did on the last joint, but this one needs to be angled in 2 directions at 2 different pitches. So just cutting those angles into the center board is a really easy way of creating my mortise. Conveniently, these huge knots are right where I want to put the joint, so I'll cut them away. The top of the mortise is angled at 6 degrees, and the bottom is angled at 16 degrees. That might not make much sense while I'm cutting the pieces, but as I begin laminating the leg together, you can see how I'm forming that double tapered mortise just by sawing at different angles. Now, my stretcher needs this triangular notch to help it lock into the leg. Cutting the short side is easy, but that shallow angle is tricky to start. So I'll make a little notch with a chisel to give the saw teeth a place to bite down. Then it's a straightforward rip cut. This joint also needs a wedge, and again, I'm going with hardwood. I need the slope of the wedge to be very straight and refined, so I'll joint it with a jack plane, and then finish it up with this lovely little wooden smoother that one of my viewers built. It's the perfect tool for delicate work and a light cut. Before I finish laminating the joint together, let's look inside and see how it works. The notch allows my stretcher to hook over the bottom wall of the mortise. Then my wedge comes in on top and provides downward pressure to keep those angles engaged and keep the bench from racking as you use it. The parts have a tight friction fit, and the whole thing holds together solidly. Real quick, let's laminate on the last board. Then we can watch the joint in action. This joint is sort of similar to the other one, but it works pretty differently. In this case, the stretcher has that notch, which causes it to come in here and hook over the edge of that mortise. Then I bring in my wedge and tighten that. And this time, the wedge is providing downward pressure. It's forcing that notch into the corresponding angle that we laminated into this mortise. That downward pressure also draws the joint together, and because the stretcher is hooked over the edge, it makes things very stiff, very resistant to racking. I also want to point out that for both of these joints, I'm using hardwood wedges with a softwood main structure. The hardwood resists getting knocked around with the mallet, but the softwood is sort of springy and it deforms more easily than hardwood. So a hardwood wedge is gripped really tightly in a softwood structure. Now, just like the other joint, this one comes apart very easily. A little bit too easily. And it's very easy to take apart and put back together again. But when I was building it, I just made it out of this thin softwood planking because that's all I had in the shop. After having built it, I'm sort of surprised at how well this thin planking works. It's pretty sturdy. So if you want to build a takedown bench and all you have around is some thin pine boards, give it a shot. You can probably make that work. For a lot of woodworkers, the bench is sort of the first major project. So it makes sense to plan it out carefully and then even physically practice cutting some of your joints. That way, when you go to do the actual build, you know you can handle the most demanding part. The joint where that long stretcher hits the leg, that joint is under more stress than any other part of the bench. And if you can cut that joint well, the rest of your build should go smoothly. Now, both the joints I've shown in this video are going to give you an excellent stretcher to leg connection. But the first one I showed, the vertical tusk tenon, that one is much more common in historical benches. This other one, with the horizontal wedge, you see that one in historical benches, but less often. I don't know if that means it's not as good of a joint. I'm not sure. I just want to point that out. Now, I get a ton of questions about Will Meyer's Moravian bench, and although I've never worked on one, I'm an enormous fan of the design. It obviously comes apart very easily, and it looks very sturdy and very efficient. If you want to learn more about building that bench, you can check out Meyer's website, eclecticmechanicals.com, which I will link to down in the description. Will has PDF plans that you can get for free. He's got articles about the bench. He's got a build DVD that you can buy. He sells vices and hardware for the bench. It's really a one-stop shop. Now, Will and I have no affiliation, we've never met, and he has no idea that I'm making this video, but I still recommend you check out his website. Now, as good as the Moravian is, it probably isn't a perfect bench for like a beginner who needs a takedown workbench. It might be a tiny bit complicated for them to build, so I'm always thinking about ways that I can make my own takedown workbench design that might be a little bit easier, a little bit more beginner-friendly, and I'm always thinking about that. Often when I'm spending time with my family and I'm supposed to be thinking about them. But anyway, this video would never be possible without my amazing patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to be one of those people, you can go on over to patreon.com/RexKrueger and check out all the rewards I have for the people who make these videos happen. And even if you're just watching this video, even if you're just a viewer, I appreciate you just as much. Thanks for watching.